Okay, so we have here at the end of chapter 26, the last two verses say that Yosef was 40 years old and he got married to these two women. And then it says that
How are you? Good.
These women were a source of anger or upset. Yitzchok and to Rivka. And then that's the end of chapter 26. Chapter 27 starts with Vayihi Kizach and Yitzchok. Yitzchok was old. It happened when Yitzchok was old. And his eyes became dark or heavy, depends how you translate it, from being able to see. Yikras Esav b'nei hagodel, and he calls Esav his older son, and he says to him, I'm getting old, I don't know when I'm going to die, and therefore going at the food. And as we're all familiar with the story of Yitzchok asking Esav and wanting to give the brachas to Esav, and then Rivka inserting Yaakov to usurp him, etc. Now, let's zone in a minute on the pasuk of Yitzchok's blindness. Again, Vayikazak and Yitzchok happened when Yitzchok was old, and his eyes became hard on sight. So, before we look at any commentaries, what comes to mind when you think of Yitzchok being blind? What comes to mind?
He's old.
He's old. So the pasuk says, and he was old, and he became blind. Do we find? What else comes to mind? We know he was old and he's blind, and he also says, "I'm old and therefore I don't know when I'm going to die, and therefore it's time to give you the bracha." So clearly, there's something about his age going on. Although in fact, he did live. According to Rashi, Rashi says on the next pasuk where he says that he doesn't know when he's going to die. Rashi says that at this point he was 123 years old, and he lived till 180. Right? So that means he's 57. He's still going to live for another 57 years. But apparently he was already concerned that his time may be coming soon, as Rashi explains there.
There was a certain reason because his relation with his mother.
That's right, because his mother died when she was 127.
Yeah.
So therefore, there's this idea Rashi brings over there that within a 5-year span of one's parents, 5 years before or 5 years after, there's a question if Rashi means a span or it means actually 5 years before or 5 years after. Whatever the case is, Yitzchok had some indication that perhaps, or some feeling, intuition, that perhaps his end was near, even though in fact he was still close to 60 years away. And according to other commentaries, he may have been. When Esav married, let's just make the thing. It says Esav was 40 years old when he married these women who were source of aggravation to Yitzchok and Rivka. Now, Yitzchok was how old when Esav was born? It says earlier in the parsha, Yitzchok ben Shishim Shana, he was 60. So if Esav is 48, Yitzchok is 100. 2 psukim later, it says that he's Rashi says he was 123. So, in other words, Rashi puts it at the end of that span, 123. Other Mefarshim bring it back and say that this story of his blindness may have happened even closer to when he was 100. Right? So he's 80 years out still. Now, the notion of blindness because of old age is not something that we know, it's not so common. In other words, we haven't seen it earlier in the Torah. We've heard of people getting old. We've never been told that anybody was blind. Besides, anybody remember who else in the Torah was blind? It's not explicit in the Torah, but it's been mentioned in the past, not coming in future parshas, somewhere between Bereshis and Toldos.
Let me get tip of the tongue. No, it's kind.
Almost Lemech, right? Lemech, the descendant of Cain, who killed his great grandfather because he was blind and he thought he was hunting an animal, and then So So on the one hand, the blindness hasn't been mentioned before as a thing at all, and certainly not as a symptom of old age. We do have it later on in Parashas Vayechi, where it says the Einu Yisrael Kovdum Mizoikin, Yaakov's eyes have become heavy because of his old age. Now, there's a couple of differences. First of all, over there it says Kovdum Mizoikin, they became heavy because of his old age. Whereas here, even though the implication is certainly such, it was when Yitzchok was old that his sight became dimmed. But it doesn't explicitly, it's a tiny little bit less explicit, I think. Right there it says he became blind because he was old. Here it says he became old and he was blind. So the assumption that you could say it's implicit that the blindness was associated with his old age, but perhaps it's not 100% explicit. There are other times in the Torah, in Tanakh, you have by Shalini and by Shmuel, there are other times when people become old and become blind. But again, see, on the one, when it comes to Pshuti Shal Mikra, you sort of have to weigh all your arguments. On the one hand, this is the only time where we find, the first time, where we find somebody becoming blind because of old age. And he's not so old relative to the lifespan of those days. And also, you have to bear in mind that the fact that we've never been told this before is not an indication that it wasn't common occurrence. It could be it was common occurrence, and the reason why we've never been told this before about anybody else is because it was never relevant. Now it's relevant. We have to understand this story that he's not able to differentiate. He's not able to see Esav and Yaakov. So in order to understand the story, we have to be able to be told that he's blind. So the fact that it never says it before isn't, so to speak, proof that it wasn't a common thing. Nevertheless, we do find the Midrash says that this was something new. I'll read to you the Midrash. Amar Rabbi Yossi ben Simon, Avraham Avinu Tov HaZikna. Avraham Avinu demanded from Hashem that he should have symptoms of aging. I think elsewhere it talks about his having white hair. Amar Lefanav, Avraham said to Hashem, the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Master of the universe, Aval Veni Nechnosim B'Mokim, Ein Adam Yodei Mi Mechabed. A father and a son walk into a place, and nobody knows who to honor. Nobody knows who's the father, who's the son, because there's no symptoms of aging. So Hashem says, yes, you're right. From you on, there's going to be this idea of aging. Avram Zokim Babayim. Okay. Yitzchok Avinu Tova Yisurin. Yitzchok said there should be suffering, because if a person dies without having ever suffered in his life, so then Midas Hadin Matucha Kenegdoi, he will be confronted. He will confront the Midas Hadin. So therefore, and if you Hashem bring suffering to a person, then that will help atone for his sins. So Hashem says, you're right, you're going to be the first one, and Yitzchak's suffering was in that he became blind. And finally we have Yaakov, who's Tavacheli, who says that a person shouldn't just die suddenly, but he should become sick, and so that he has indication that his death is near. And that's in fact what happened to Yaakov, that he says over here, if he doesn't know that he's going to die, he's not going to be able to mechashev esbanav, which he won't be able to to say farewell from his family. So, but if he becomes sick for 2 or 3 days, so then he's miyashev b'dati mechashev esbanav. Okay, so then he has warning. So it implies from this medrash that Yaakov was only sick for a couple of days. We don't know how long Yaakov was blind for, but again, it implies that he was blind only from
Yitzchok.
No, Yitzchok we can say was blind for many years. Yaakov, we don't know how long he was blind for. It says, "Ein Yisrael qouting Muzoken." It may have also been a very short period of time. Now, actually, I saw that in some Mefarshim, Rabbi Bechaya and others, they say that everyone, most people, like the deterioration of the body includes lose of eyesight, lose of hearing, lose of the sense, loss of some of the senses. And he says only by Moshe Rabbeinu do we find that the Torah says that he was 120 years that his eyes did not dim at all, and that was miraculous. And Moshe Rabbeinu, who was such a pure body, as literally just a vehicle for the revelation of Shekhinah, his body remained 100% healthy. So we see from there that short of Moshe Rabbeinu, then it would be normal for one's eyesight to deteriorate. Anyway, so thinking about Yitzchok's eyesight, loss of eyesight, again, the simple reading of the pasuk, the straightforward reading of the pasuk, seems to say that it was associated with his age, and we do find blindness being associated with age by Yaakov Avinu. We find that the Torah emphasizes that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't. That the novelty of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he did not lose his eyesight with old age. So again, the indication that old age is a source of loss of eyesight. On the other hand, it wasn't so old. He was still 60 years before he died almost. And
But Rabbi,
again, just one moment. And also, I think it's important to reiterate, it's not 100% explicit in the pasuk. It's implicit that the reason for his blindness was his age. But it's not explicit like it was by Yaakov. He was blind from old age. Here, just as he was blind and he was old and he was blind. Now, yes, Mark.
there was a phenomenon since Adam Arishon that in each generation people were living less and less and less. So perhaps, even though he lived 60 years beyond, he was already on decline as part of this trend in terms of his life. And he didn't die right away, but his later years were
Compromised
almost like
health.
he was.
Compromised health.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually interesting that you say almost like he was dead. Rashi later on says that Summa Chashuv Kameis, that somebody who is blind is like he's dead. Right? So.
Right. It's
Okay, so. Now,
don't you
as you look at the
don't you
drash.
think it was also because Hashem didn't want him to see Esau's wickedness?
Okay, so let's go through that. If you look in the midrashim, in the various midrashim, from what I could find, the Medrash gives 6 reasons. Not all in the same Medrash necessarily, but in general, if you to collect all the midrashim, you will find 6 reasons why Yitzchok was blind. Let's read a shtickle of the Medrash inside, and then we'll see. Okay. Vatechena in Merois. Amar Belazar ben Azar Merois Bera Merois Beraos Shel Rasha. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Yi Yitzchok Yotzel Shuk V'Yeh Berisa Amrin Den Avoda Hu Rashia Elrei Machas Ein Avo Yoshu B'Seich Beisai. So the first thing the Medrash says is that Hashem didn't want Yitzchok to have to go to be out and to be in public, seen in public, and people say, "Oh, you see that man? He's the father of Esav. He's the father of that Rasha." So what does Hashem do? Hashem makes him blind. The person, once he was blind, he was basically homebound. So Hashem made him homebound so that he shouldn't have to experience, or people shouldn't go around pointing at him as being the father of Esav. This is the meaning of the pasuk. When Rishoim rise, when the wicked rise, a person should hide. You can't amru.
But nowadays, it doesn't matter anymore. In fact, some of the worst people are the most visible.
Yeah. But this was for Yitzchok. Okay,
Yeah.
that's one reason. Davar acher, a second reason. Meira ois b'koyach ois re'iyah. שבשעה שעקד אברהם אבינו את בני הזעם במזבח בוכה מלאכי השריס ונשו דמויס מעיניהם לסייך עיניו והירשו מויס בסייך עיניו. that when Avraham Avinu took Yitzchok to the Akedah, we find the pasuk Heinerolim Tzoak Chutza, which means that basically tears fell from the eyes of the Malachim into the eyes of Yitzchok, and they were Rishumus B'Seicheinav. They had left a scar in his eye. And so that with time he became blind as a result of that. So the Midrash is clearly saying that even though this happened when he was, according to Rashi, he was 37. So, according to Rashi, this was a good 80 years ago or so. Yeah? But with time it took its toll on his eyes. Now, what exactly this means, obviously angels don't have physical tears. What exactly that means that the tears of the angels fell into his eyes? Okay. Davar Acher, number 3. When Avraham Avinu put him on the Akedah, Tolo Einav B'Amorim, V'hibit B'Shchina. Yitzchok looked at the Shchina. Moshe 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 Lamar David Daimel Lamelach Shem Mital BePesach Paltin Shalai. V'Sala Einav B'Rab B'Noshel Oyavei Meitzah Zalav Menachalein. So imagine you have a king who's taking a stroll in his, royal chambers, and he notices his friend's kid peeking through the window into the palace. Omar im hariga achshav animachir zahavi. If I kill this child now, I'm going to bring suffering on my friend. Rather, what I'm going to do is block up the windows. So Yitzchok looked into the Shechina. So Hashem says, I can't kill him, but I'm going to, so to speak, stop up the windows by making him go blind, and therefore when he became old, he became blind. Now this midrash seems to make it look like a negative thing, that he, so to speak, dared to look through the window to look at the Shechina. Again, the midrash is not telling us exactly what that means. But in another midrash which I saw somewhere, it portrays it as not as a negative thing, but as part of the process. Just like he says, part of the process of dying is a person sort of transitions between this world and the next, and is able to see Spirit God. So Yitzchok sort of had that journey, the out of life, the near death experience, and came back. So he saw it. It wasn't not sort of blaming Yitzchok for it, but the consequence was blindness in later years. Now another medrash I have here, that because of that anger causes one to go blind. So because the previous pasuk says that they were angry at the daughters of Esau, the wives of Esau, so that anger caused them to go blind. In addition to all of that, we have other midrashim say that this is associated with the idea of sheikhad. The pasuk says that if a judge takes sheikhad means
bribes.
If a person takes a bribe, so then it causes the wise to be blind. Now in that context, it's talking figuratively that you're blind to the arguments of the case if you're tilted to one side. However, the Midrash connects that here with Yitzchok being loving to Esav, that this was a form of sheikhad of sorts, that he was blinded to Esav, and that affected his physical blindness. In addition, we have the Midrash that talks about Ashanon Shal Elu, that the smoke from the pagan practices of the daughters-in-law affected Yitzchok's eyes. And then finally, we have the midrashim that say that the reason he became blind was in order to facilitate the rest of the chapter, that Yaakov should be able to take the brachas. So I think I just actually said 7 reasons. Let's go through them again. That means, first of all, we have the reason of which is almost explicit in the pasuk, that he became blind because of his old age. But now, incorporating all the different midrashim, I think we can add an additional 7 reasons. Number 1, Yitzchok should not be looked at and sort of treated badly as being the father of Esav, so we keep him homebound. Number 2, the tears of the malachim. Number 3, the fact that he peeked at Hashem. Number 4, the fact that he was angry at Esav's wives. Number 5, the smoke of the ketores, of the incense, of the pagan practices of the wives of Esav. That was number 5, right? Number 6, the sheichad, the bribery. And number 7, because so Yaakov should take the brachas. Now, this is medrash. All of this is medrash, and probably there's a lot to be say and derived and analyzed for each one of those. But if you were Rashi, and you were trying to write a commentary that purported to be pshutei shel mikra, the straightforward meaning of the pasuk, what would your comment be on Vayihi Yitzchok Yitzchok v'aticheno einav merois?
The smoke from the odors or of the daughter.
You think that
Because it's more of a shot, but it's a tangible thing. It's smoke. He's getting.
So Ira is saying that the smoke is from all these other things, the malachim, the tears, all these other things are very spiritual. The smoke is a tangible. It makes sense, right?
And it was in the pasuk before about the.
Oh, very good. And contextually, it also makes sense because the previous pasuk, the previous 2 pasukim talk about those women and how those women would irritate him, right? So you think that of all the interpretations, the most pshat one is that he was blinded from the smoke for 2 reasons. If I'm combine both of what you're saying, firstly because that's a physical thing that's very easy to relate to, and secondly because contextually that pasuk comes immediately after the pasuk which talks about them.
And the 5-year-old has to be able to understand it.
I always wondered, did Rivka? I mean, we have no record of it. Plus, there's a record. So did she ever get involved and say, "What do you keep making excuses for racist clothes?"
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There's different.
Like the salt. Yes, they used to ask someone, to take mice from the salt. I mean, these kind of things. And she says, "Oh, he's just playing up to you." If she ever tried to.
Yeah, so there's different approaches to that. I think that from a Chassidus perspective, there's certainly what to be said in Pshat. I think there's from Rav Hirsch has something on that. It wouldn't surprise me to find in the Rishonim. I don't have off the tip of my head, but I think that from a Chassidus perspective, the idea of Esav is that he has this tremendous potential, and had he actually used his potential, then he could have been even greater than Yaakov. And that's Yitzchok's perspective, where Yitzchok has this potential where Esav could go more. Now, I'm going to challenge you guys, because you're saying that it makes sense to say that he was blind because of the smoke. But surely, if he was blind because of the smoke, Rivka should have also been blind, and the daughters-in-law themselves should have been blind. And Esav should be. Why did the smoke affect Yitzchok more than anybody else?
Because other reasons weaken the eyes, the teardrops are walking.
So now we're incorporating other reasons. I have another problem with what you said, Ira, because I'm surprised. I would say that if you're talking pshat, you would say he became blind because he was old. I mean, that's basically what the pasuk says. So why we running? Yeah, l'chayra, the idea of he became blind because he was old is. I grant you that blind because of smoke is more pshat oriented than is tears from the malachim or things like that. But certainly the age is the most. Again, that's what the pasuk says. He was old and he became blind, right?
I mean, that's a more logical assumption than the others, which are more speculation. Don't you think? That he didn't want to see Esau's bad ways, and
Right.
he wanted to avoid.
So you're kind of saying what
society.
Reuven was saying, that that it's implicit in the the context of the pasuk is that we had these bad women over here, and then he became blind. So it seems to be
He
associated.
didn't want to see what was
Yad
going
Hashem, the other ones. Whereas this is more like, it's really Yad Hashem involved, there's natural stuff about.
Now, why Esav didn't become blind? You could, well, Esav was always out. He was out of the house. Yitzchok was homebound, so he would have been affected by it. But what about Rivka? What about the women themselves?
Rivka wasn't.
He was old. He was the oldest of everyone there. And he's their father, and there's
So
Rivka, he's even younger.
Right. So you're saying it's a combination of, at the old age, he's more sort of sensitive, and to the smoke. Okay. It's interesting that I saw in some of the midrashim they bring. So two things I saw in the midrashim about the difference between Yitzchok and Rivka and the wives. The Mizrahi brings that Yitzchok was more disturbed than Rivka about the Avodah Zarah. So it's an interesting thing, sort of his emotional.
She was hardened to it because
It had a physiological effect on him because emotionally he was more disturbed by the whole thing than Rivka. So therefore I had to think. Now there's another thing which I don't know what to make of this. I'll just repeat to you what the Mefarshim say. They say, and imagine if you have a bone utensil, you have a bowl made out of bone, and you take a bone and you bang on the bowl, it's not going to break it. The bone won't break the other bone. But if you have an earthenware utensil, and you take a bone and you bang on the earthenware utensil, it's going to break it. So he says, Yitzchok, who's a man was made from Adama, he's made from dust. So therefore he's more fragile. Whereas he's more frail. Whereas the women who are made from the bone, so they're stronger and they're not. Anyway, be that as it may, that does remain a. So the chayra, again, I think what we've established so far is if you were Rashi, first of all, you would say he became blind. You wouldn't say anything. The pasuk says he became blind because he was old. If for whatever reason you did have to say something, you would choose from all the other reasons we have. You would choose the idea that he became blind because of the smoke. Now, in fact, what Rashi does is like this. He says, became blind from the smoke of these. So what you said. Then he says, Davar Acher, alternatively, when his father, and he brings the idea of the Malachim's tears falling into his eyes. And then finally he says, Davar Acher, Shayitol Yaakov the brachas, so Yaakov should take the brachas. Right? So Rashi says 3 out of the 7 reasons, out of the 7 midrashic reasons that we mentioned, Rashi picks 3 of them. And again, the smoke, the tears of the Malachim, and so Yaakov should take the brachas. Now, here's very interesting because the Rebbe's Rashi Sichas have all these principles, but this is an unusual one. In Rashi, you don't often have 3 interpretations. You often have 2. You don't often have 3. So the first thing you've got to know is that the first one that Rashi brings in general, whenever Rashi brings multiple, the first one is going to be the primary one. Right? So you're spot on, Ira. This primary one is the smoke. Now, before we understand why the primary one is the smoke, there's a much more important. Why is the primary one not his age? So I already said that it's not 100% explicit, but it's pretty much explicit, and we find precedent, or it's not actually, it hasn't happened yet, but we find that Yaakov, we had the same idea. And here the Rebbe brings up this point, which is like it's so fascinating, and it's the same theme that runs through another Rashi Sicha as well. In the previous parsha, we learned that Avram Avinu was scared to give a bracha to Yitzchok because he didn't know if it would go to Esav, would be wrong, so he left it up to Hashem. And then he says, that Hashem blessed Yitzchok.
That was after the Akedah, right?
Yeah. So now we're not talking about regular person anymore. Now we're talking about a person who has a special bracha from Hashem. And if I tell you, we're talking about Yitzchok has a special bracha from Hashem, he became blind because of his old age. And you're like, hold on a second. We don't find blindness of old age being so rampant in those days. And Dafka, the person who has the bracha from his old age, a special bracha from Hashem, he's the one who becomes blind from his old age, more than Rivka, who's in, and more than, well, he's saying he's younger, but, right? He's the one who becomes blind from old age, and for 57 years at least. According to other Mefarshim, it's 80 years. Right? So it's something that it seems counterintuitive that somebody who has such a special bracha from Hashem should be blind for so many years just because of his old age. And therefore Rashi says, okay, we have to add some more over here. Why is it that he became blind? And therefore, to start out with, Rashi says what you all agreed, from all the midrashic ones, seems to be the best one. But that's not good enough. And here's the thing. So usually when Rashi brings two pirushim, so the Mefarshim say, if Rashi brings two interpretations, we're always going to say, well, each one of them has, there's a problem with A, so we have B, but there's a different problem with B, so we have A. And if you take them both in unison, so then all the problems are addressed. In other words, like this. I think the pshat means like this. So it's not pshat like one doesn't make sense and two doesn't make sense. So if you have two things that don't make sense, right, that doesn't work. I think the idea is based on in other words, all the interpretations are true. And Rashi is acknowledging that within Drush, there's many true interpretations. But we just need to bring something that will address all the difficulties involved. So if interpretation 1 addresses all of them besides one of the difficulties, we need to bring something else that will address the difficulty that was neglected by interpretation 1. Now, it may be true that interpretation 2 will have a different difficulty, but that's fine because that difficulty is addressed by number 1. But the point is, you have to see them both in unison. It's not like you have two things that don't make sense. They're both true. Once they're both true, so then. Now here, Rashi says 3 perushim. So the Rebbe does this sort of Gemara type of thing where he says you have to have a tzrichasa in all of them. In other words, there has to be, each one of the 3 has a problem that only one of the others can deal with, and that's why Rashi needs to bring all of them. So the problem with the smoke one, the main problem with the smoke one, is why did this affect Yitzchok more than it affected Rivka, or more than it affected?
I think probably because he had a soft spot for Esau. He had hope for Esau.
Okay,
So
and
this
therefore,
is a way to not put him in despair.
so therefore,
as a blessing, Hashem made it so that it wouldn't hurt him so much.
okay,
All
interesting.
the senses.
Right.
I always thought because Yitzchok was pure, Rivka came from a household of voters, or she was more, I would say, used to it, hardened to it, whereas Yitzchok, he just couldn't take it.
Right. So that's, you have the Mizrahi says he was. It makes sense that it disturbed Yitzchok more than it disturbed Rivka, because Rivka grew up with it, and Yitzchok didn't. So that's why it was more disturbing to him. Yeah. Okay. So therefore, so the problem with this one is a perfect one. It makes sense, Begashmias, and it's contextually it makes sense, and that's why it's the primary pirush. But Rashi still wants to add a little bit more, because at the end of the day, why Yitzchok more than Rivka? And Bechlal, how did this smoke? Like they were doing the Ketores in Yitzchok's house. I mean, they could do that in their own house. So therefore, Rashi says another thing. You know what? There's another thing. And then he brings from, again, he's choosing from 7 different midrashim over here. He says, the second pirush is the tears of the Malachim. Now we've answered the question, why it's only 8 Yitzchok, because Rivka didn't have the tears of the Malachim. However, the difficulty with this pirush, the primary difficulty is that in terms of Pshutei Shel Mikra, it's the most far-fetched, right? In other words, the fact that there was smoke from the Ketores, like you said, that makes sense. Even the third one, that it was a miraculous thing that he became blind in order to be able, that he would give the brachas to Yaakov, it's not explicit anyway in the pasuk, but it fits the narrative very nicely, right? Whereas this idea of the Akedah, the tears of the Akedah, that's like you're pulling that out of thin air.
And it happened so long ago.
Oh, and it also happened so long ago. So in the Medrash, it says that it sort of was in his eyes, left a scar for all these years, and then he became blind. Rashi doesn't say that. It could be Rashi would hold that according to that interpretation, Hitaka became blind at the age of at the Akedah. It's unclear. But it's literally out of thin air. It's literally out of thin air. Again, the first one fits the context very nicely, and even the third one, that he just became blind miraculously in order to bless Esav, fits the narrative nicely. This one is out of thin air. However, the Rashi still wants to bring this one again. Why does Rashi choose this one over the others? Because this one is the only one of all the reasons that has no negative connotation to it. There's nothing bad going on, right? You talk about the smoke. You're talking about Esav being married to these to these people. Even the third one, you talk about he had to come blind so Yaakov could get the brachas. You're already indicating to the fact that Yitzchok had this misplaced love and trust of Esav. And certainly, if you look in the Midrash, he was peeking through the window where he shouldn't have. He had bribery. He was angry. All of these things are things which talk in negative. So therefore, Rashi takes from all of these there's one quality. So again, the second interpretation that Rashi brings has a lot of challenges why it ought not to belong in Pshutei Shel Mikra, but it has one virtue over all the others, which is why Rashi chooses to bring it, namely that there's nothing negative. It's all positive. There's nothing negative about Yitzchok in it. There's nothing negative about Esav in it. There's nothing negative about Yaakov in it. There's nothing negative about anyone in it. But then we come to a third interpretation. And the third interpretation says that he just became blind not for any tears of malachim, and not for any smoke, and not for one reason and one reason only, so that to enable Yaakov to receive the brachas. And on the one hand, we don't have to deal with the other questions that we had before about why Yitzchok is only the one who's getting blind and not Rivka. Well, obviously because he needs to, and why. And we're not dealing with things which are sort of out of thin air. This fits the narrative very nicely, and everything else. But it still doesn't suffice as being the only. That's why Rashi leaves it to the end, to the third, because at the end of the day, to say that Yitzchok had to be blind and homebound for 57 years just so Yaakov could get the brachas, Hashem could have easily orchestrated this in another way, and therefore Rashi leaves that to the end. Okay, we'll stop here. I found this very interesting to take a pasuk, which Rashi has three interpretations on, see what all the options that lay before Rashi are, and figure out why Rashi decided to interpret it with these three the way he did.